All right, morning everybody. Welcome to the first week of the JPA certification classes. So this is the first of 11 weeks. So we're going to go all the way up until almost December. I think the first week maybe in December is last week. We've got quite a few people that are on this course. So the EJB one, I think we started out with 15. Here we've at least got about 30 people starting out. So I hope a few more of you finish it. This first week, we're going to do a bit more, so I'm going to look at some of the admin stuff around just how the certification course works and what you need to do. And then we also need to cover two topics. The one is really tiny because we've got 13 topics to cover. This week we're doing two topics, and then somewhere towards the end we're doing another week we're going to be doing two topics, but pretty much every week we're only going to be doing one topic. If you've got any questions, I say sort of either just say something or just type it on Google Chat, group chat, and I'll try and pick it up. And you can interrupt me anytime, so don't worry about that. Don't wait until the end. At the end, you can ask questions if you want to, but otherwise, just butt in whenever. All right, so looking at the course, so we're going to have a class, as you know, every week, Wednesday, from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. South African time for our guys that are dining from India. So the idea is that whatever you need to prepare for the class, prepare it ahead of time. So there'll be some reading. We've only got one book for the JPA course and the specification as well. So the specification isn't too bad, actually. It's a bit better than the EJB one. And then also come to the class prepared and you can ask questions. Hi, guys. Just grab a seat anyway. So you can ask questions, and if you've got anything you want to find out about more, the class is a place to come and ask those. Then the checking that you actually are preparing for the class and studying. We're going to have a review quiz every weekend. So the quiz will usually be plus minus 10 questions. And you'll have an hour to answer that. So that'll be on Fridays. The quiz will open at 3 o'clock and will close on Sunday night at 12. So it'll be 10 questions. It'll be based on the current week's material, and maybe it'll might include something from the next week, just to sort of keep you on your toes, to make sure you may be reading a bit ahead. Roy and I haven't decided yet, but we might do an assignment as well, and we'll probably do a mocking exam assignment as well, just to make sure everybody's on course and knows how to do mock exams and all that. So the course material we've got for this is the Pro JPA book, so you should get that from the Moodle website, and the Persistence API specification, version 2.0. There's also a mock exam that's uploaded on there, so we use the ETS viewer for that. So the ETS viewer is just a little exam simulator type application, and on here there's 4 different tests, so each test here sort of tries and simulates the actual exam. It won't be the actual questions from the exam, but they will be close enough to it. So the mock exams are sort of there to sort of give you an idea of what the exam is going to be like, and also to test you to see that you know your stuff well enough before you go to the exam. The main thing about these mock exams, and I'm just going to quickly run a custom one here, is whenever you do the answers, once you finish and you review it, and I'm just going to evaluate it there, it's important to go and see why certain answers are correct, but also why certain answers are wrong. That's good. That's good. So that's also why I use Infoware, is because it's actually got a lot of more information on there than just a bunch of questions with answers on there. So if you actually go on there, you can go and see what's wrong, why is it right, why is it wrong, and also a lot of the questions will give you a big explanation about the subject or the objective that question covered. So it's good to go and read for that. So from a mock exam point of view, don't just go and do the questions. It's important that after you're done going and reviewing it and actually seeing why answers are right, why they're wrong, what was covered there. It's something that we maybe didn't cover in the classes, maybe something that wasn't in the book, and I've sort of found that to be very valuable. So don't just use the mock exams to race for the questions. And then we've also got 2 demo applications that we're going to use. So the actual Oracle course for the JPA certification has a little demo application, which is the second objective of the exam for some other reason. There's no questions about it though. So we've got one from Infoware, so the guys do the mock exam. They've also given us a little mock application, which we'll look at the end of the class, and also the book has some source code as well. So the book, there's and scripts to run all those explanations of everything. So as we're going through the book, the source code is there as well. So you can use that to sort of see what it looks like. Then just run the attendance. For the class, you need to attend 8 out of the 11 classes. And the way we check that is that there's a attendance quiz at the end of every class. So during the class, we're going to give a keyword. You're going to go into Moodle, and I'll show you now, and you're just going to answer that one question with the attendance word, and that's sort of how you sort of almost like signing in, saying, listen, I attended the class or was at the class. And the other bit is Moodle. So hopefully everybody has checked that they can log into Moodle. So if you log into Moodle, you go to the OCEJPA course. On there we've got our weekly breakdown covering what topics we're going to look at, and we'll fill this up as well as we go on, so you'll see if only done the first few weeks. It'll be what you need to read for that specific week. I generally upload the presentation that I do in the class the night before or a day before. I'll upload the presentation, so you can download it as well. And then here's where you get your attendance and your review quiz. So your review quiz is the one that we're doing on Fridays to Sundays. So you're going to do that with the 10 questions, and then you do your attendance quiz. So all you do is you just go to your attendance quiz. It's not open yet. There you'll go and you'll submit your answer, submit it, and it'll be done. So it's quite simple and easy. I'm pretty sure most of our highly skilled IT guys will be able to figure it out. Shouldn't be too difficult. And that's it. And then any other material you upload, like you've seen, you might have gotten some emails from the forum. Forum is under general. Got a news forum there. And Roy and I will generally upload any new course material, anything interesting, we'll put it on the news forum, and you can go and grab it from there as well. Or we'll just send an email to the group. So that's Moodle. Everybody's still cool? All right. Then just looking at the certification. So the actual certification exam, which isn't, well, it's why we're doing the certification course as well, but it's not the ultimate goal for this. So the certification exam, this is an expert level exam. It's got 64 questions that you need to answer, 135 minutes, so just over 2 hours. So a bit more than 2 minutes a question, and you need to get 61% on this exam to pass. Now the Oracle exams, generally the percentage, the pass mark there is an indication of how easy or difficult it is, although they say it isn't, but it is. So something like the EJB certification, which isn't a difficult one, the pass mark is sitting at something like 73%. It's quite an easy exam. The more difficult exams usually have a lower pass mark, just to get a few more people through. So this one isn't an easy exam. You're going to need to put in quite a bit of effort. Then during the class, like I said, you're going to do the review quizzes, and we're going to look at class attendance. Review quizzes is going to give you a mark for the classes. So on there, if you get 70% or plus, then BBD will pay for the certification exam. This has changed since last time, so if you do fail it, if BBD pays, then you're going to have to pay it back. I don't know why they changed it, but anyway. And if you get between 50 and 69, BBD will pay if you pass. So you pay it yourself, and BBD will pay it if you pass. If you get less than 50%, then it's up to you. You can go and write. I'm pretty sure if you pass, the BBD will still pay it. But these are sort of the hard and fast rules, but I'm sure we can get past them. Then sort of when to go and write the certification exam, if you want to, we generally try and say go and write it 2 to 3 weeks after we finish the certification course, so it's still fresh in your mind. You don't have to go back. But that means that you're probably going to have to write before the 16th of December. I don't know how many people want to go and write the certification exam before Christmas, so it's probably going to be next year. Last year with the REST certification, we did do one last sort of catch-up class in January, so we might look at doing that again just to give a bit of a refresher. But if you want to, go and write it 16th of December, and then it's done and out of the way, and you've maybe given yourself a nice little Christmas present in your certification. All right, so the course outcomes, the reason we do these certifications is one is just to sharpen, for the specific now, JPA skills in the company. And after this, you should hopefully be known as a know-it-all JPA expert in BBD. And you can also go and do your Oracle Certified Expert certification. So if you haven't done the program certification, or you haven't written the certification before, you can still go and write this exam, you're just not going to get the actual certification yet. So you have to go and write your programs exam first, if you haven't done that. So the way we're going to do this is you need to read the book and the specification. So each week we'll sort of say these are the minimum things you need to read. If there's anything else we found, we'll also add that to it, but at the minimum you need to read the book and the specification, probably more than once. You need to study and prepare for the review quizzes. So don't just wing it on the review quizzes. Write those review quizzes as if you're writing the certification exam. You know, sort of flag it if you're not sure about something. And with the review quizzes that we're doing on the weekends, you've got quite a lot of time to write that. So you can take your time and really try and get it right. The other bit that you need to do is to write the code. So write code. So we're going to give you, we've given you some mock applications to play with, but you have to write your own code. Go and set up a JPA project from scratch, you know, using Maven, using Ant, just straight up normal Eclipse project or IntelliJ project, whatever. But you need to be able to do that and just write it yourself, because that's the only way you're going to learn. Reading the stuff in the book and doing the review quizzes isn't going to teach you anything. It's just going to tell you about things. Actually writing code and playing around with it and seeing what happens if you change this to that, that's what's really going to make the difference. And you'll see if you do the quizzes, if you're actually writing code, you're playing around with the code, if you go and do a review quiz, it'll just make a bit more sense. That you won't see the code in the review quiz and it looks foreign to you. You know, if you've actually written that code, you've seen it, it makes it much easier to understand. And doing the mock exams. And like I mentioned, when doing the mock exams, don't just do the exams. Go and read afterwards why questions are right, why they're wrong. That's really going to help you a lot when it comes right in the certification exam. So looking at what sort of your environment you need for this. So you can use any of the normal Java IDEs, Eclipse, NetBeans, IntelliJ, Notepad++ if you want, Sublime Text, whatever you feel comfortable with, it doesn't matter. Normally the demos I'll do in IntelliJ, and I might jump between Eclipse and NetBeans as well, just to show guys how it works on those ones as well. The one thing that I like to use as well is Squirrel SQL Client. It can connect to sort of any database, so it sort of helps a bit. You don't need to get it. If you just want to do the normal REPL type stuff, you can do that as well. There are some JEE questions, so we're going to need to use a container. Both the applications use Glassfish for. We're going to see if we can maybe use Tommy as well, because the Glassfish burned me a bit of the EJB certification classes. I don't like Glassfish anymore. So I might try and use Tommy for that. Then databases, all the demos are going to be using DerbyDB. So DerbyDB comes with the JDK, so there's nothing extra you need to install. If you've got the JDK installed, you'll have DerbyDB. If you want to use any other database, that's fine. The thing about the JPA is that you'll just need to change some of your properties, and then it should just work. So if you want to go and use something like MySQL or SQL Server, you can do that as well. But I'm not going to, in the class, I'm not going to do anything else except DerbyDB. So to get this set up, get whatever IDE you want to use. If you haven't got one of those containers, get them up and running, and make sure you know how DerbyDB works, whatever database you're going to use. Like I say, sort of try and get one of the demo applications up and running, or do a tutorial online or something. Just do one and just see that you've got your environment set up and that you're happy and you know what's happening there. Oops. And I say that's it. So any questions around the class or the review quizzes or what you need to do, join the class, anything like that? Dave says Beaver as well. Okay, yeah. It's another one you can use instead of Squirrel. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with the first topic of the week. So, like all the Java certification courses, usually the first objective is sort of a kind of an overview of what the certification is about. So in this one, we're going to look at ORM and what ORM is. And we're also just going to touch on what is probably like the three main bits around JPA: your entities, the entity manager, and your persistence unit. Now, the entity manager actually have separate topics later on. So next week we're actually looking at the entities, and I think 2 weeks after we're looking at entity manager. So we're not going to do, so it's not too much in this first topic around them, but there isn't a topic specifically around the persistence unit. The persistence unit we'll see later is around the configuration when it comes to JPA. So each topic will have some sort of configuration. So each topic will probably go and touch a bit of the persistence unit, but there isn't a topic specifically about it. So this first topic, there's actually quite a bit in around the persistence unit. So I'll spend a bit more time on that. And the review course will also have probably more questions about the persistence unit, anything else in there. Oh, mentioning that, one thing that when I was preparing for this that I did pick up is, because it's a bit more about the persistence unit, I've included chapter 14 as well as part of the reading for the week. So chapter 1 and 2 on the Pro-JPA book is short and easy, and 14, you can probably just look at the first up. There's stuff around schema generation, which you don't have to worry about for the certification. So just the first bit around chapter 14. And then in the specification, the whole of chapter 8 of the specifications around the persistence unit. Okay. Everybody's happy there? Yes. All right, so object relational mapping, or ORM, and I'm not going to say object relational mapping again, I'm just going to say ORM for the rest of the time, is sort of sits on the sort of in between, let's say, your data layer and your business logic layer or something. So, and like most, let's call them well-architected systems, you'll have different layers in your architecture. And the ORM is sort of one of those interfaces that sort of hides the nuts and bolts away from what's happening below there. So you don't necessarily want to go and see how you're connecting to your database, how your SQL calls look. You don't. That sort of gets hidden away under your ORM layer. So that's what the ORM layer does. It sort of hides away those JDBC calls. So an ORM is also what's known as sort of a data source architectural pattern. So just so some of the other ones which are available, if you want to know, is a table data gateway, which is a separate object which will look at an entire table and do sort of processing on those. There's row data gateway, which is the same, except instead of using a table, it uses a row. Then there's active record, which is the object itself, has the insert and update and delete functions on it. And then data mapper is the other one that you'll probably have seen before, something like Dapper uses that. And that sort of just sits as a layer between your database and your objects, but you still need to write your own SQL code. So data mapper is sort of one of the patterns which is being used a lot more these days. It was cool, and then it wasn't cool anymore, now it's cool again. So data mapper is the other one to look out for. So why should we worry about ORM, and specifically JPA? So the main thing that ORM tries to address is what they call the impotence mismatch, and that's sort of looking at your objects. If you've got an object in your code which represents a employee or a student, and you've got a table in your database which represents the data for that, do the fields map one-to-one. So if you've got your student name, your object will have a student name. If your object has got a surname, the table will have a surname. But maybe in your object, your name is just the full name. It doesn't break it up between surname and last name. So there's always some sort of mismatch, or it might be a legacy table where there's fields in that table which you don't actually worry about or care about anymore, and you don't necessarily want those on your object, or there's computed fields which you can calculate later on. So there's always some sort of mismatch between your tables and your objects. So that's what the ORM tries to address. Like I mentioned, with the data mapper, you still have to write your own SQL. With ORM, it actually generates a SQL. So that's one of the big benefits. Well, you can see it as a benefit or a negative, that it generates the SQL for you. So you don't have to go and write your own SQL for it. And the main thing about JPA that makes it really nice to work with is that it uses plain old Java objects, so POJOs. And what that means is you've got a class, and that class doesn't need to implement some sort of interface. It doesn't have to inherit from some other super object or parent object. It can just be a normal class, and you can use that for persistence. So what that gives us is non-intrusiveness. So your code stays a lot cleaner. You don't have a bunch of pro functions all mixed in there. It gives you object queries. So with the JPA, you get what we call Java persistence query language. So it's like SQL, but actually it's not SQL. So you can actually write one SQL query which can run across any database. Well, I say any in quotes. You get what they call mobile entities. So you can take that object, which represents, let's say, your student or your employer. You can move it out of your persistence layer to somewhere else, bring it back, and push it back into your persistence layer. So it doesn't need to keep track of it. It doesn't need to be linked to it. You can actually move that object around. And then also it's simple configuration. Well, I also say simple, and I say simple, and I say it in quotes, because it depends on what you want to do. If you're just doing straight out of the box stuff, yes, it is simple. And you do that by annotation or by XML configuration. And the thing that's sort of nice about JPA, and that also comes from EJP as well, is there's a lot of defaults. So you don't have to go and put in 100 different properties to get the thing to work. If you don't do anything, it'll just work straight out of the box. So that makes it a lot easier just to get going. But that's also sort of one of the things that the defaults might necessarily be what you're looking for, and you might need to go and change it. That's sort of where ORM sometimes doesn't work so great. And also because ORM, like I said, gives you another layer on top, it allows for easier testability integration, because you're hiding all that nuts and bolts behind that ORM layer. So check any questions yet. Okay, so start looking at the JPEG. So in the exam, they're not necessarily going to ask any questions directly about ORM, asking what ORM is or how it works. I think this is part of the objective, and it looks like this is part of the objective just to give you some intro into what JPA is and what it's about, sort of an overview. But I don't think they're going to ask any specific, straightforward, direct ORM questions. It's not going to ask you about data mappers or anything like that. So looking at the first sort of JPA concept, which is entity, and which is that sort of pojo I spoke about. So entity is that little object that we're going to use to represent your data from your database or your persistent store, your data source. So it's going to be lightweight. That entity is going to have attributes, so fields, stuff like student number, student name, courses, whatever. And it's also going to have relationships. So if you're going to have a student, that student might have courses. Those courses can have lecturers. So there's some sort of relationship going there as well. And the characteristics of that entity is that it's going to be, it's got persistability. I might need to kill, let me kill that call there. I don't think anybody's going to join. Hang up all. So it's got persistability, so not necessarily while it's in memory, but you can actually go and persist that to your data source. It's got an identity. That specific entity will have an identity, which will probably be a primary key from your database. So you'll be able to differentiate between one record and another record in your student table, and the objects that represent them will be able to differentiate between them as well. We'll have transactionality. So if you're using EE, or EJBs and you're using container managed, you probably won't see that. But if you're using your normal standard edition Java or bean managed concurrency, bean managed transactions, then you can actually go and set that. But that also only happens when you actually commit or save that to that. And then they also talk about granularity, and that is sort of subjective, I think. So you're not necessarily going to have an entity which has got one field on there. So an entity isn't just a normal primitive. So an entity isn't an integer. An entity isn't a string. An entity is an object that's going to have attributes and relationships. And you also don't want an entity that's got 500 fields on there, because that's also sort of defeating the purpose. So an entity, they said, lightweight domain that represents a specific business object. The same way you look at any object-oriented design, you don't want an object that's a super object or a guard object. Same thing when it comes to your entities. So to go and define anything as an entity, you just go and mark it with an add entity attribute on top of the class, or via XML. And I'm just going to jump here. So this is just a normal, straightforward employee class. What you do is you just go and mark it with an add entity, and that makes it an entity. The idea is just to define that. That's the primary key. But otherwise, you can see there's not much else in here. And you can also do this via XML. So you don't have to go and put any code on top of your actual classes to go and mark these. Just some visuals around it, and the actual specification has got this listed out nicely, is that your entity must have a public or protected no arguments constructor, same as if your EJBs, and the entity must be a non-final top-level class. So it has to be an abstract or a concrete class. It can't be an enum. It can't be an interface. It can be inherited classes. You can inherit and all that type of stuff, but it needs to be a class, abstract or concrete. Like I said, that's sort of what an entity can look like. So you can see sort of when we when I spoke about the normal POJAs, plain old Java objects, that's what they look like. There's nothing funny in there. There's nothing crazy you have to do there, and it works. So you need something to sort of manage these entities and actually do what it needs to be doing there, and that's where the entity manager comes in. So your entity manager is sort of probably represents the biggest part of the JPA. So the entity manager is what you're going to use to apply most of the things you need to do for the JPA. So your entity manager manages your entities, and all the entities that your entity manager manages is known as your persistence context. So that's an important thing to understand. So your persistent context sort of says this specific entity manager manages my students, it manages my courses entities, it manages my lecture entities, it manages my subject entities, and all of them together as part of the entity manager is your persistence context. And maybe I'm just going to jump you to a little picture here. So you can see if we look here, we've got our entity manager there, and that manages your persistent context. So your entity manager, the way you get that is you get that from the entity manager factory. So you can never go and say entity manager equals new entity manager. You have to get it from your factory. So you're going to go and say, you're going to get your entity manager factory, and from entity manager factory, you're actually going to go and create your entity manager from there. Like I said, that manages your persistent context. When a persistent context is the sort of boundaries around all the different entities that specific entity manager manages. And then we've got this persistence class here, and the persistence class comes in when you're doing using your JPA with your standard edition Java. So that's like a little bootstrap class that you use up. If you're going to be using EJBs, then you can just inject that via your add resource or your normal CDI. You can actually go and inject your persistence context by that instead of doing it by the persistence class. And the other little bit is your persistence unit, which you're going to look at now, and that holds your configuration. The persistence unit actually goes and says which entities is part of this persistence context. So which entities are my entity manager going to manage? The persistence unit tells your entity manager which database to connect to, how I connect to this database, what type of transactionality I'm using on this database. So it's all your configuration sits in your persistent unit. So just sort of to reiterate, because this is sort of important now. So you've got your entity manager, where you create your entity managers from, entity manager factory, where you create your entity managers from. That entity manager manages your persistent context. Your persistent context is the boundary around all the entities that you want to manage as a whole. And your persistence unit is your configuration for that. So your persistence unit goes and says which entities are part of your persistence context and which data source to connect to and how to connect to those data sources. All your configuration on that. Let's see if I've mentioned that earlier. No, that's it. So like I said, just looking at some code here. Next week I'll probably open up some more code. There wasn't much code for this week. So the entity manager factory, you get that from your persistence, create and manage factory. So this is if you're using a standard edition Java. And then from there you just say create entity manager, and it gets you entity manager. You probably just want to, and like I said, when you create the entity manager factory, that sort of says which persistent unit you're using, and that's the name. So you've got an employee service is the one it's using there. So looking at the persistence unit, and like I said, like I mentioned, that's the set of entities that the entity manager is going to manage. Your persistence unit is a name configuration, so you're going to give it a name, like you saw on the previous slide, employee service, and that's going to declare which classes form part of your entities that you're going to manage and your data store info, connection strings, if it's EJB, if you're using JP and your EJBs, which data source you're going to connect to, so you actually GIND name you're going to use for that. Now the persistence unit is just an XML file. It's called persistence.xml. And a single persistent XML file can contain multiple persistence units. So although you've got one file, you can have multiple persistence unit, and you can also have more than one persistence XML file if you want to, but most you'll only have one. That'll be weird if you've got more than one, unless you're sort of combining different modules in an EJB jar or something. And like I said, that single persistence unit is linked to a single entity manager factory because it's linked to one persistence context, which is one entity manager. Now in this certification exam, the persistence unit, specifically looking at this first objective, they ask a lot of questions around the packaging and deployment when using your persistent unit. So that's also including a bit of it in this first objective. So taking all your persistent sort of attributes, artifacts together, so it'll be your persistence.xml and all your entity classes. They generally put them into a single jar and they call that a persistence archive. And that persistence.xml needs to be in the meta-inf directory in that jar file. So that's sort of the basics for it. Persistence.xml needs to be in that meta-inf directory, and that archive jar needs to be in your class path. So if you're going to be using a year file or EJB jar or a war file, it needs to be, so if it's in an EJB, it'll need to be either in your EJB lib folder. If it's in a war file, it can either be in your library folder there or as part of your classes folder. But it needs to be somewhere where it can pick it up. If you're looking at your standard edition Java, it needs to be probably easiest will be in your system class path. So it needs to be somewhere where your application is going to be using that persistence archive can get to it. And generally where that initial persistence.xml file is located in your meta-inf, that's known as the root of the persistence unit. And the reason that's the root is that you can have external files as well. So you can, from your persistence.xml file, you can actually refer to other jar files, but the root and the way you get to those is that using that root as the root for it, and it'll be relative to your root where the other jar files are, where any other configuration files are. Like I mentioned, I have more than one persistence XML. The main thing is that each persistent unit that's in your persistence.xml file, that name thing needs to be unique. So you can't have the same persistence unit name. So you can't have one that says employee service and then in that same persistent, in that same scope, so in the same jar file, have another persistence unit that's also called employee service. That's going to conflict. Let's go to one of these files. So this is what the persistence XML would look like. So it starts with your persistence tag to say this is what it's about. In there you can have multiple persistent unit tags in there. So you go and name that. So that's important that each one has its own specific name. And we've got here, which is also your transaction type. So we'll look at it in the future topic, but that just sort of, and the only reason you'll have a transaction type there is if you're going to be using standard edition Java, it needs to be resource local. But if you're going to be using your EJB, in the EJB, then generally your container will manage that, and you'll use the JTA, the Java Transaction API, to manage the transaction. So anything you specify there is resource local or JTA. That's the only thing you're going to mention there. So one of the other ways that you can specify which classes is in your persistence context, or which classes is going to be managed by a persistent unit, is by actually defining it in your XML. So you can either go and use your @entity, like we saw earlier, on your class, or you can specify it in your persistent.xml file. There's another way you can do it. And then the last bit in there is your properties. And the properties, any specific, so it'll either be data source specific properties or provider specific properties. So if you're using Hibernate, there'll be Hibernate specific properties you pass through there. If you're connecting to MySQL, there'll be specific MySQL properties you put in there. And so as part of the certification, you don't need to know every single property that you can have in there. You just need to be aware that that's where they are. And then if you're running it in the EJB, you can't go and change these properties at runtime, but if you're running standard edition Java, you can actually go and programmatically go and adjust your properties if you want to. So the main thing is, when it comes to the persistent unit, is defining sort of which entities fall into that persistent unit. So which classes is my entity manager going to manage? And they talk about, and what the term they use for that is managed classes, because we're going to manage them. So there's 4 ways that a class can be a managed class. So the first one is all your local classes that are annotated to classes. So in that jar file, or in one of the jar files that the persistent XML references, you've actually got the @entity attribute on top of your class. So that's the first way and the easiest way. Then you can have classes in your mapping files. So that is another sort of way of actually defining it. We actually, instead of just saying this is an entity, actually go and say this is an entity, but I'm including these fields and these fields and these fields. And we look at the ORM.xml in a later objective. There's another way. The other way, like I said, is explicitly listing it, and that's using that class element. like I showed here. So that's another way. So if it's got the add entity in front, if it's in one of the mapping files, or if it's in your persistent XML and it's actually listed there as a class. And the last one, if it's in one of the additional jars, so you can, in your persistence XML, in here you can actually go and specify additional jar files relative to your persistence root, and that'll sort of say, okay, well, if these are marked with add entity, they also include new managed classes. And then, like with the EJBs, anything that's in XML overrides anything that's in annotation. So if a class is marked as an entity, with your add entity in the code, you can actually go and override it in your XML to say it's not an entity. Or if it isn't marked with an add entity, you can actually go and override and say it is an entity. So the XML always wins above annotations. So you can already see in the exam, if they're going to ask you a question, they might give you a bit of code and a bit of the persistence XML and actually say, okay, well, which classes are going to be included in the persistence unit or in your persistence context? You're going to need to look at these rules, and one might be that it's excluding a specific class from the managed classes. So that's sort of one of the important things around the persistence unit. So for the exam, what I suggest you look at is when these things are, when sort of tricky questions around managed classes, when are they, when aren't they a managed class? And you actually the deployment around that. Where your persistent.xml sits in your project, so if you're using an EO file or using a WAR file, where would you have to put that persistent.xml? Where would you have to put that jar file that contains your persistent.xml file? If you're using a jar file, it needs to be in that meta-inf folder. That type of stuff. So trick questions could be they might put that persistent.xml in a different directory. Then it won't count. It won't be a persistence root, and your JPA won't pick it up. So it won't be nothing. And that's sort of a rushed one around the JPA concepts. And so I think if you go and read the book and look at some of the examples, it probably will make more sense. That's sort of why I said, sort of, if you before coming to the class, just read some of the stuff in the book. Even if you just scan it, it'll help. Questions? Anybody? Okay. Guys, if you do join via Hangouts, just mute, because otherwise we can hear you. Who's this? Mega. Mega, can you mute your... I can't get to it. Okay. If you don't mute yourself, I'm going to mute you. All right, so that's the first topic. So like I said, sort of looking at what ORM is, where it fits in. I don't think there's going to be any specific questions in the exam for specifically related to ORM, but you need to know about it. Looking at the entity manager, just the basics around that. You know, when is something an entity? What does the entity manager represent? Your persistent context, your persistent unit, how that little picture, how that fits together. And looking at your persistent unit, the deployment around that now, and how you define what your managed classes are. So in a nutshell, that's sort of what you'll probably need to know about that first one. Okay. All right, so the next topic is this introduction to the auction application. So they've got this, as I said, because it seems that as part of the JPA course that you can do at Oracle, they're using this auction application as sort of the demo application for it. And for some of the reason, it's part of the topics. We've looked around, and generally we can't see, nobody says that they've ever asked a question specifically about this auction application. So why they've got it here, I don't know. I think it was some lazy administrative person at Oracle that just sort of took what I do in the class and just translated it to these are the objectives, and then actually read what it's about. And then later on, I think they were too embarrassed to go back and remove it. But anyway, it is there. We don't necessarily have to worry about it. So, like I said, what we're going to do is we're rather going to use the InfoWare one, or you can use the InfoWare one, and we're also going to look at the JPA 2 book source code. So there aren't any questions about it. It's just a sample application, so we're going to use the InfoWare one. So we've put it on the news forum, so you can grab it from there. So the thing that's nice about that, it's got all entities and DBA stuff really set up, so it's quick and easy to get going. And I'll start it up around it now and just show you. So it's got code samples, you can go and look at the book and see how they do it there, and go look at some more code samples and sort of do your own thing and sort of see how that works. And then I've also just put the link in there, so if you actually go to the InfoWare site, that'll give a bit more of an explanation about it, and also a short explanation of getting it running. But what I'm going to do is I'm just actually going to start it up and just show you guys how to get that thing running, because the description is very minimalist. It's the minimum they're going to give you. The JPA2 source code, there's like a whole README file, a big explanation of how to get it up and running, so I'm sure you guys can get that up and running yourselves. So the main thing about this application, the other one about this one, is to getting your Derby DB up and running. So if you've done the programmer's certification, you've probably worked with Derby before as part of the JDBC topic there. But for the guys who haven't done this before, like I said, Derby comes by default as part of your JDK. And what it'll be is wherever your JDK is installed, so which will generally be program files, Java JDK, and then there's a DB folder, and that's where you'll find that. So if I just quickly open this up, program files, Java, go to your JDK, you'll see there's your DB folder, and this is where your Derby DB sits. And your bin folder is where we start and stop and do all that stuff for the application. So this hasn't got a nice little front end and all that type of stuff. It's all command line. So for the hardcore command line guys, awesome. Guys that don't like command line, not so awesome. So that's why you can use something like Squirrel, or I think some of the IDEs actually have little bits built in, so you can use it from there, or Beaver as well. So to get it running, we run that start network server.bat file, which is start network server.bat, which is that one there. And that actually starts up, and it starts up quite quick. And unless you go and change your startup bits there, it'll generally run on port 1527. So that'll be the port it runs on. So I can just go and grab this and just start it up. No, I don't want to download. Just going to a command line, run from there. And then it starts up in a few seconds. You see, boom, it's up and running and ready to go. So the database of DB actually stores the data in the in your file structure. So wherever you start Derby up, if you don't specify as part of your connection string, and you can go and read up on this, you can Google it, as part of your connection string where your database folder is going to be, where it's going to save that data, it'll just create a folder in whichever directory you start your Derby up. So because I'm starting it up from my user folder, any database I create will actually be in my user folder now. And so the other thing you can do is you can do this ij.bat for REPL access in Derby. So if you want to go and actually do select splat from blah, 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 that type of stuff, you can do it from there. One thing to remember there, though, is if you type in a SQL statement there, you have to end it with a semicolon. Otherwise, it's going to think you're not done with your statement yet. So that's the only little catch there. And that's it. So to get the this little toy JPA DB up and running, if you're doing it by NetBeans or Eclipse, you're just actually going to need to start it up like I did now. So have it running before you start. NetBeans, you can actually stop and start it from NetBeans, which is quite cool. I'm going to go to IntelliJ here. Yikes. So with IntelliJ, you can open up your database tools. If you don't know where that is, you can just go to your search button, double shift, and type database, and it'll bring it up. And then what you're going to do here is you just go and add a new data source. For Derby, it'll be remote, not embedded. And you just go and capture all your details for that on there. So I've already set it up. Which allows you host will be localhost, port 152.27, like I said, that's your default host. The database for this needs to be called toy JPA DB. If you want to change the database name, you can, but then you need to go and update the persistence.xml. So we're just going to look at the little thing. We can see there's our meta-inf folder, and here's our persistence.xml inside there. So that's the persistence root. Let's go through this so you can see here's all our classes that it's defined. Like I said, that's going to be part of the managed classes for the entity factory. The name of this entity factory is my PU. Sounds dirty. My persistence unit is probably what they're going for there. And then we've got our properties at the bottom here, which for this we're using Eclipse Link as the sort of ORM stuff of Hibernate. We've got our Hibernate connection property, so you can see we're connecting to Derby here. And there we can see there's our toy JPA DB. So if you want to change the name, you can change, but you have to go and change your persistent.xml. And then you can also go and specify username and password in plain text. Awesome. So let's get back here. One thing that you just need to go and do the first time you run it, you need to just set create equals true. So when it starts up and the database is in there, we're telling Derby it's actually going to create the database for us. The application doesn't go and do it itself. There's nothing in there that actually goes and creates it for you. So if you don't have that in there, you start up the database, it's going to try and initialize that database. It's going to give you a bunch of errors about the database not even existing. So you need to set create equals to true. And so I'm going to change this. You don't have to put in a username and password. By default, this application doesn't require you to have a username and password, but most of your SQL client tools and Eclipse and NetBeans don't like it when you connect to a database without a password. IntelliJ couldn't care less, but the other ones actually want you to have a username and password. So just go and add that in. And you'll see in the persistent.xml that the bit for the username and password is actually commented out. So I'm just going to test the connection. So because I'm testing it and I've got create equal to true, it'll actually go and create the database for me. So that's created. And that's it. Then what you need to go and do next is just go and run on the GUI client. We're just going to run the JPA test. So as it runs down, it actually goes and creates a few tables and all that. The first time you run this, before you do anything, just do an initDB, because that's just going to go and put a bunch of data in the tables for us. You can see in the background here, it's running a few things here, and then that's it. Then we can start looking at this. So they've got a few different options here. So you get criteria query, JPA query, and execute business logic, and actual methods. So we've got a nice little help thing here. So if you want to test actual JPA queries, so we're doing that sort of third quarter of the week, and you want to play around with JPA queries, you can actually just go and put them straight in here. Put that in, and then just run JPA query, and that runs and returns the result for you. When you look at something like the business criteria, you can actually go and put your code straight in here as well, and say execute criteria query, and that'll execute that as well. Or if you execute business logic, you can see there's some actual logic there as well. You can go and run that. Then if you actually want to stay for it, you can run this in debug mode, and you can go and select one of these functions here, and then just actually call the method. Because all these other ones, because you're actually typing in the thing, it uses reflection to go and execute that. So if you actually want to go and step through the code and see how it hits the JPA and the different entities and uses it into Manager, it's going to be a bit difficult. But with the call method one, you can actually go and put a breakpoint on one of those methods and actually step through it. It's a nice little app. And just to show you, so because I ran this from my users folder, if you ever want to kill this database, you'll see, so there's the Troy JPA DB. So whichever file directory you run Derby from, unless you're actually going to specify it in your connection string, which file path to use, it'll just put it wherever you're running Derby from. So if you want to kill this database, you just go and delete that folder. So I can do this, it's stopped. So let's see, not connected. So you can actually go and kill this database here. Still running. Let's show those. Oh, kill Derby first. Here we go. Okay, so I can just go and delete that directory, and it's gone. So database gone. If you want to do this for NetBeans, NetBeans is a bit easier. So you go to services, under services you've got databases, and that doesn't say Derby, it says Java DB, but that's your Derby databases. So from here, like, so you can actually go and start your server from here. That'll start it up. Then you can go and create a database there. So the database name says toy JPA DB. Username app, password app. The password app. You can see Derby actually asks you where your database location is. So NetBeans, not Derby. NetBeans actually asks you where that needs to go. I think I've put one there, so I'm just going to call this ToyPad1. Otherwise, it's going to complain. So NetBeans, much easier. It goes and creates that for you. So I'm going to change this database name so I can connect to it. Well, this is in NetBeans, gives you a nice little UI for that. Just going to change the database to 1. And same as the other ones, under the test GUI one, just go and run this file. And if everything works out, it should start up like the other one did. So you can see once again, Hybrid doing anything, doing a DB, and that's it up. So NetBeans a bit easier. Go to services, set it up there, create the database from here, that's good to go. Stop it. All right, and then Eclipse. Eclipse, you need to open up your data source explorer. As with NetBeans, you just go and add a new database here. Just say which type one you want to add. So say Derby. Name. Database name for JPA-DB. Like I said, just make sure you've got great database on there the first time you connect to it. I need to start up. I'm going to start it up again. So I said sort of NetBeans is nice that way for you. It actually starts it up. I can just do this. Up again. Okay. So it connects, then you can just go and run that again. JB, can I open exception? Okay. You know what the problem is? I changed the persistent XML. Let's go back here. It's important to do the same source code. Let's change this back to that. And that's in a DB, so it started up. Need it. Okay, but anyway, this is sort of the idea is that you solve it. Derby DB started up. If you're using NetBeans, it'll start up for you. And then just add your data sources. You're good to go. The JPA2 source code, that's got AND files, so and BAT files you just run. So to set that up, there's a whole README file for that. So if we just go. There's all getting started things. So that thing explains everything, so I'm not going to go through that. And if you don't get Glassfish up and running, don't worry too much about it. I think there's one topic around running it in servlets and EJBs. So don't worry too much about that, but the rest of the thing is some environment properties we're setting up, and then from that just pretty much run deploy.bat on any of the examples you want to do. All right, so Wimbo wants to know what's the relationship between Hibernate and the properties of the persistent XML demo and the JPA. So Hibernate is an actual implementation of the JPA specification. So the same thing that you can get top link is the other one, Eclipse link is the other one. So it's just an actual implementation of it. The same way that with the EJBs, Glassfish will have an implementation of the EJB specification, or Tom, you'll have an implementation of the EJPA specification. So Hibernate is an implementation of the JPA specification. All right, so and on the website there's a little RDM for that toy JPA if you want to see what that looks like. That was the demo. And then any questions? Okay, so I say we covered quite a bit in this first session. So next week we're looking at entities and what that looks like. So important thing for this week quiz is 10 questions this week for an hour. Like I said, look at specifically the persistent unit, deployment around that, and manage classes. There'll be 1 or 2 questions about Entity Manager, but mostly about persistent unit. If you haven't read this week's topics yet, read it. So it'll be chapter 1, 2, and 14. So it's a bit of reading. Chapter 14, I think you can go all the way till before schema generation. Of course, you're not doing that at all. Read it if you want to, but you don't need to read it for the quiz. And then for the EJB certification, we didn't actually read to go too much for the specification, but the JPA specification isn't too bad. There's actually, well, I wouldn't say the EJB specification didn't have valuable information in, but it was very boring to read. The JPA one is actually quite nice, and they've got nice examples. It's concise. There's not a lot of repetition, a lot of fluff in there. So definitely around the business rules for the different things, go and read the specifications. So I'll include the specification sections each week as well. So for this week, it was 3.1, 2.1, and section 8. And then for next week, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. So there's anything about the entities. And then, like I said, sort of look at getting your environment set up. So try and get that toy JPA DB up and running. See if you can play it onto the Pro JPA. So as you're reading through the book, chapter 2, it's got a whole bunch of examples as well. See if you can get those up and running, actually looking at the examples. And if you want to, do a short little tutorial of just getting your environment setting up and just write your own little JPA application. Let's see if you can get that going. All right, so we should try and get this up and running, Dave. Let's see. Fail to create database. Maybe service the next exception for details. Yeah, no, I don't know, Dave. Are you going to paste the solution, or Dave, or I will use MySQL. Okay. When I say sort of the examples, use BBD because, like I say, it just comes with JDK. But if you want to use a different thing, it shouldn't really make a difference. It should just work. The only thing you'll need to go and check is just sitting in your persistence.xml, just getting the right properties for that, and you'll just Google it, you'll find it. It won't be hidden somewhere. All right, so the attendance keyword for this week is database. So like I said, sort of go to, it should be open already. Let's see now. How to review quiz. Attendance quiz. Why is this not open yet? 23 September is today, 6 a.m. Well, let's check. The server time on this is like broken. So I think maybe it's even, it used to be out by like 20 minutes, it might be out by an hour now. Okay, what I'll do is I'll set the attendance quiz back to like a day or something. Just set it back a day. Hopefully that'll be open. Okay, so there it is now. So I said just go to your review attendance quiz, say attempt quiz, and put in database, next, submit all and finish, and that's it. So every week, give the attendance keyword, you need to go and capture and fill it in. If you don't do that, then we pretty much, even though I saw you in the class, if you didn't do this, I'm going to say you weren't in the class. So that's the only proof we've got that you were in the class. Not my sort of me being an eyewitness to it. So database is the attendance keyword for the week. If there aren't any other questions, then that's it, guys. Thank you, and see you next week at 7 o'clock. Cheers.